All right. So we are now recording, and I wanted to. I've got some slides that I'm going to be sharing with you. Um, Now, I sometimes I go through slides, sometimes I don't. I have a little notepad where I describe some things, but today I do like some of the slides that they have to offer because it keeps me on point. If any of you are like me, I can just really ramble on about anything at any given time. So anyway, slides sometimes keep me focused and keep me on point with what I need to do. So today we're going to be talking about lifespan development, okay, that for the rest of this semester. And there are different ways to set this up. I've seen it go in chunks, talking about child development and then talking about adolescent development and then talking about adult development and then going through the different ways of breaking it down, like the big four, which is physical, cognitive, emotional, and sociological and cultural. But I don't do that. I kind of take the chunks of time. We talk about prenatal next week. We'll talk about birth the following week, and then postnatal and infancy the following week. So I kind of cover it more in broad strokes as far as the age of development. And the reason I do that is because it's a little easier to track that way. And we don't have a lot of time to really cover everything there is to cover. So next week, I will talk a little bit of about prenatal stuff, but then I'm going to jump into maybe one of the theorists of development like Piaget or Erickson. And a little bit later, we'll talk about Lawrence Kohlberg or something like that. So I'll sprinkle that in with it because it's going to be important to track those stages of development as we get a little bit older and as we're seeing this development occur. Okay, so let me share my screen with you so we can go over some of these slides together. Let's see. Desktop 2. I have way too many windows open. PowerPoint. There we go. All right, so hopefully you can see what I'm looking at there. All right. So lifespan development, as it says here, it's the field of study that examines the patterns of growth, change, and stability in behavior that occur through the entire lifespan, hence the name, right? So we look at lifespan from cradle, what we say actually before cradle, prenatal to death, okay? Because it's really important to see how these experiences can be different for everybody. And you've heard the analogy that we're all like snowflakes, and we really are. We're a collection of our experiences and our genetics and our hereditary genes and traits that we acquired through our ancestors to our culture, right? We may have similar genetic makeup and similar cognitive abilities, but our culture has maybe taught us things a little bit differently, and therefore we grow up a little bit differently, right? So we're all really different because there are just an infinite number of experiences that can occur within two individuals. Okay, so anyway, we examine that and pay particular attention on the younger years, because the younger years is where we can really start to see where problems might occur later on in life. If a child is not meeting, like, for example, potty training or walking or talking by 2 or something, if they're not meeting a milestone either physically or cognitively, that might be an indication that something might be wrong. We could have really a host of a melange of disorders or learning disabilities or something that's occurring. And it's important for us to catch that early. Why?
So the interventions can be put into place to better aid development, or to, if you aren't able to aid kind of a fast forward of the development that is delayed, kind of aid in development of other skills that will then improve the development of the milestone that isn't being met.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So intervention is the key here, because what happens if a child maybe has a learning disability, we'll say like dyslexia, or maybe even autism or something like that, which isn't a learning disability. It's a completely different thing, but it could cause a learning disability. So if we learn earlier on that a child might have a different type of learning ability, we want to capitalize on that earlier on, because otherwise they're going to get left behind. They may develop inferiority. They may develop some bad, like maladaptive behavior or something like that. So that could that could put that child in a trajectory of problems later on in life. And of course, they would not be a productive member or a less productive member of society, because they're constantly in trouble, because that's what they learn to do. All right, so it's really important earlier on to kind of detect these things and make sure that they're milestones. So how psychologists within the developmental field, they look at their assumptions through the nature and the course of human development by applying scientific methods. Now, we talked earlier about correlation, right? In your Psych 101 class and any other psych classes you've taken, you're going to look at the scientific method, which is a little bit different than just saying, hey, I think there's something wrong with that child over there, or that person was probably not nurtured enough or had insecure attachment. You know, we want to be able to qualify that by some kind of observation. We may want to conduct an experiment on a person or a group of people to see, you know, is there something that's deviating from the norms? Okay, so all it's really talking about with applying scientific methods is, again, qualifying that with existing research that occurs. How do we know that this child is not meeting their milestones? Well, according to this source, you know, between the ages of 18 months and 24 months, they should be at least crawling, if not walking by then. Okay, so now we kind of have something in there. We can say there might be a problem, other than, well, you know, my child started walking at age 1. You know, that while that probably works for you and gives you a basis of comparison, it's not a very scientific method. Are you with me? Does that make sense? All right. So, so lifespan development, it focuses on human development. And again, these aren't really what we've experienced in the last probably 30 years is the inclusion of different cultures. Okay. Because we've made some striking changes over how we interact with other cultures, either diplomatically, you know, either at a government level, or maybe we've even visited or lived in cultures that that are different from ours, right? Within the United States itself, you know, we've brought in a lot of different cultures, and we're seeing a significant rise in education within the workforce. So those cultures are very important to understand, so that we can adapt and understand how children, again, you know, like if we have a child from a Middle Eastern culture comes into a school system here that is predominantly, he would be the minority in that in there. We have to really understand that, because if that child does not feel welcome and that child does not feel included, again, what could happen?
Development of certain milestones, particularly social, um, will be delayed and inhibited because of the lack of cultural awareness.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That child, once again, is going to be left behind potentially, which could set him up for additional failures in his life, and even maybe behavioral problems or mental health problems. Okay. So it's very important to understand that this is something new. I'm not going to say new that we're encountering. We're getting better at it. We're still not quite there, but we're getting better at accepting cultures in everything that we do. Okay. Looking at cultural and racial and ethnic differences, individual traits and characteristics. Okay, these are all things that that a developmental psychologist focuses on. The other thing that we focus on is change and growth throughout their lifespan. Okay, now we're usually looking at a conglomeration of people within their cultures, not necessarily, a development or behavioral psychologist will work with an individual, but a developmental psychologist is somebody that's probably looking at bigger picture and looking at trends of students, trends of workers, so on and so forth. Okay. But we look at stability. We want to see how stable has that person's life has their life have been. Like in the military, I experienced this a lot. A lot of people didn't shift from environment to environment very well. Some spouses or partners didn't make the move very well because maybe they were homebodies. Maybe they enjoyed being at home with their family, and then they're taken out of that culture, put into thousands of miles away in a different culture that they have a hard time thriving in and developing in. Okay, so again, these are all things that would be an example of instability or inconsistency in their environment. Okay, and then lastly, lifespan developmentalists are interested in people's lives from the moment of conception until death. Okay, so that's usually a misnomer. There is that we're only interested in child psychology, but that's not the case. We look at prenatal because prenatal is important. When we look at somebody that maybe had the mother did not have awareness of what it was to be nurturing and help that fetus develop, that might be a problem too, right? And as we'll see next week, there might be some practices like smoking or drinking or taking certain drugs that could be bad for the proper development of that fetus, which again, we're going to see follow into their early childhood, later childhood, and potentially adolescence and adulthood. Okay, so that's very important that we look at that. So the typical areas in lifespan development that we look at, they fall really on 4 different categories here. And the first one that we look at is physical development. Okay, you remember I told you we look at cultural, we look at sociological. How are they fitting in with society or socially? And cognitive, how is their cognitive development? But their physical development really involves the body's physical makeup. And that includes the brain, the nervous system, and really the muscles and senses. Okay, how do they start acquiring the necessary skills for food, for gathering food, for asking for food, for language development, so on and so forth. Okay, so these are some of the questions that we're going to be asking in the developmental phase. All right. How do they cope with stress? So we'll go back to the slide here. How do they cope with stress? All right. What are the benefits? Maybe one of the things we're going to look at, what are the benefits of breastfeeding? Okay, during physical development earlier on. A little bit later, we're going to see, how do they cope with stress and outward and internal signs of aging? Okay, are they aging healthily, right? Or are they go on a path of self-destruction or something? And of course, how do they define death? We'll see that a little bit later. Okay. All right. So for cognitive, I spend a lot of time in cognitive development because physical development, I don't want to say it's easier. I don't want to say that it's a easier topic to cover or something easier to grasp, because it's not. I mean, it's a lifelong decision making. I'll give you an example. When I used to work at McDonald's when I was a teenager, and I loved McDonald's. I ate McDonald's almost like when I was growing up working there, and I worked a lot, probably 3 squares a day. As I got a little bit older, I moved out of that phase a little bit, but I'll never forget. I was moving from Alaska. Was it Alaska? Yeah, it was Alaska to Maryland for when I had a Air Force assignment change, and I think I had about a month and a half off to do the move, and I took some personal time just to kind of get reacclimated. And the whole way across, I ate McDonald's. We stopped at Outback, just ate out everywhere we went. And I landed in Pennsylvania to spend some time with my family, and then down to Maryland. And within a month and a half, I had put on almost 20 pounds. And it occurred to me at that point, well, I got to make some changes. Okay. I can't act like I'm can eat whatever I want anymore. So that's kind of what speaks to that physical development is being aware of what changes we need to make through our developmental phases in adulthood. Okay. But cognitive development really involves the way that growth and change in learning memory. We're going to look at problem solving and intelligence and how that influences a person's behavior. Okay. So, what some of the questions we'll be asking is what defines intelligence? Are there ethnic and racial differences in how we define intelligence? Okay. Just out of curiosity, just kind of toss it out to you. How would you categorize, how would you describe intelligence? What is intelligence? Anybody?
I mean, if we're looking at it from a perspective of the earliest stages of development in infancy and early childhood, intelligence could just be awareness of the world,
Mhm.
awareness of their physical body and how it pertains to the space around them, awareness of the caregivers in their lives, and formation of those concrete attachments.
Okay. Okay. So what I'm kind of summarizing what you said here is how an individual thrives and adapts to their environment, right? That's
Yeah.
basically what intelligence is. Okay. And it could be they adapt very easily, or they adapt very slowly, or they don't adapt at all. But that's really the essence. And when we talk about intelligence, you're going to hear like Wechsler's intelligence scale for children or adults or something like that. The Woodcock Johnson produces a level of ability to achieve something. You're going to hear about intelligence quotients like IQs. Now, those are very much based, they were based on Western civilization, Western society. So it really does not take into account some Eastern cultures. Okay. So I'm not saying universally they're getting a little bit better. I think we're on our fifth version of the WISC, which takes into account some cultural issues. But just because a child is not able to read English or Spanish and unable to take that test doesn't mean that they deserve an IQ, and we should strip away that title of possessing intelligence. Okay, so there are a lot of things to approach with that. So when we get into intelligence, think about that. Think about what are some ethnic and racial differences in how we define intelligence. Okay, what does intelligence look like in adulthood? How do we adapt? How do we, uh, as we mentioned here just a bit ago, how do we adapt and thrive in that environment? Okay, so that's cognitive development. That's how one of the ways that I'll approach. And again, I spend a lot of time in here. We'll talk about Piaget for a lesson and do some examples with that. Okay, so personality is another way that involves ways that really look at the characteristics between one person and another, and how that may change over life for that one individual. Okay, because generally what we find is the predisposition, like if somebody has a calm, relaxed demeanor in childhood, we tend to see that pretty consistent throughout their entire life, unless like a tragedy occurs or something like that. But we'll talk more about that in lessons to come. Okay. Some of the questions we may ask here are what are how can we promote cross race friendships? Okay. With personality differences, right? Our personalities, again, are very much embedded in our culture and upbringings. So if we have two different cultures with personalities that may clash, right? Maybe somebody has like adopted a collectivist way of lifestyle, like we see that in a lot of Asian cultures, right? Very collective. They look at society as being successful together, as opposed to more, Western, like the United States, being more individualistic. Okay, where we look out for ourselves sometimes. If we can't be any use to society until, you know, we've got a good bankroll or something like that, right? That's kind of an individualistic way of thinking. So what are some, how are those embedded in our personalities and how we present ourselves to the world, right? What emotions are involved in confronting death? We'll talk about that a little bit later. All right. And then lastly, oh, did I miss? Okay, I think social, I meant to talk about social development. So social development and how they interact with each other and form relationships, and how are they stable through the course of their lives. And we may see that in early or later adulthood. How many times has a person been married or in a serious relationship? You know, has it been one time that they met somebody that they spend the rest of their lives with, or have they had about 20 different partners? Right? That can happen. Okay. Does that indicate that they have a stable relationship or a stable way of forming relationships? Maybe not. Okay. Or maybe they're happy with that. Who knows? It really depends on that individual. All right. So major issues that we're going to encounter with lifespan development. Okay. Well, before we get into that, let's see. Actually, I wanted to kind of give you the terms if I can find them. I apologize. I did want to move this over here. All right. Am I still screen sharing?
No.
I'm not.
No.
All right. Okay, so if you want to take note of how we're going to be going, how we're going to be talking about these in terms of age ranges and differences. So the prenatal period is conception to birth. Infancy and toddlerhood is birth to 3 years old. Okay. Preschool period, 3 to 6. Okay. Middle childhood is about 6 to 12. Adolescence from 12 to 20. Young adulthood, 20 to 40. Middle adulthood, 40 to 65, and late adulthood, 65 to death. Now, a lot of what we're going to be talking about in some of our theories, you're going to hear like with Piaget, Jean Piaget's model for cognitive development, you'll hear like 0 to 2. These are just like suggested age ranges. That doesn't mean if a child has not mastered, try to think some of the, if they haven't mastered walking by 2, that doesn't mean that they are deficient in some way. Maybe they lacked the opportunity or something like that. So there are many things that could affect that, but these are just really generally suggested ranges. Okay. All right.
You're not sharing screen right now.
I'm not sharing the screen right now. Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Oh, how about now?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, let me put that slide back up there. So if any of you want to look at that again. So those are the age ranges that will be. And again, I just want to point out that people mature at different rates and reach development at different points. So these aren't hard and fast rules. And again, environmental factors can really play a significant role in how these stages are likely to occur. Okay. All right. Hopefully you all have that. All right. So let's talk about the different issues and how they occur in lifespan development. Okay. As you can see here, we have a couple different options that we could do. Like we have continuous change and we have discontinuous change. Now this applies to some of the theories that we're going to be talking about. Like for example, Piaget is very discontinuous. That means when stage 1 has been achieved according to Piaget's standards, we're going to see them move on to stage 2. Okay. And that is kind of, you know, one of the criticisms of developmental psychology is which is it? You know, can we say that these occur in steps Or can we say this just kind of gradually changes? They may start walking first and then socialize, or maybe they're crawling around and socializing, you know. But just because one stage has been met doesn't mean that they have evolved to another stage. So anyway, discontinuous talks about just how it occurs in steps, whereas continuous has it, achievements are just built gradually, okay, based on previous levels. All right. You also hear about critical period versus sensitive period, okay? So critical period is where it's necessary for normal development to occur. And if it doesn't occur to that point, then it may not occur at all, or it may occur at a degraded rate or a degraded level. So for example, our critical period of language is estimated to be around 7 years old. That means if you haven't learned a language by 7 years old, or if a child hasn't learned a language by 7 years old, that skill probably is outside of their window to understanding a language, okay? And I actually have a movie. I don't know if I prescribed it to this class or not. It's Mockingbird Don't Sing. I don't think I actually have it for this class. But anyway, it's a great representation of a true story of a girl that was basically sheltered and abused by her father for up until I think age 15, I believe. But she was kept away. She wasn't able to socialize with anybody, her brother or her mother or anything. And right around age 15 is when they found her. It might have been actually age 12. But anyway, she was malnourished. And as far as I know, up until today, she's still not able to acquire a language because that critical period has been met. So that's what critical period talks about. Now, on the opposite end, not opposite end, but close other side of this is the sensitive period. Okay. So they don't look at it as people not being able to develop skills after a certain time. Does anybody know why we introduce second languages in high school, in middle school and high school? Any clues? What it is offering students is an opportunity to break out of their
Brain development.
What's that?
Brain development. They still continue brain development, and it's just like you put extra input and it increase their abilities about that.
Yeah, you're on the right track there. But their brain is still developing up until early adulthood, really into our 20s. So our language recording is still able to be picked up. We can pick up different languages if we choose to, if we're able to, if we're exposed to that. So what happens after adulthood is if we haven't learned a second language, we haven't learned how to break away, be creative and think outside the box and think of different ways of saying, calling an apple. If we see an apple, we're just kind of stuck in that mode if we don't learn a second language into early adulthood. And it's very, very hard for somebody to become bilingual after the age of middle 20s, having not been exposed to any other languages prior. So that's kind of what we do that in the school systems is, science has shown that language is far more difficult to gain in adulthood than it is in early childhood. So that's the reason for that. I thought that would be an example of a sensitive period where it's not impossible for somebody to learn a second language. It's just going to be significantly harder based on the brain development. Okay. So one of the courses that I teach is infancy and early childhood development. So what the lifespan approach is talking about here is we're going to be looking again at the full spectrum. Now we're going to spend a lot of time in the early childhood and adolescent period because those are very, very important and critical to the other stages. However, we are going to spend time in early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood, so on and so forth, because those are important for many of you that are going into the field. Maybe you're not working with children at all, but if you wanted something more specific, you could get into a class that deals specifically with death and dying and aging, or you can talk about early adulthood or even adolescence. There's an entire class on adolescence, but this one just covers the full broad spectrum. And of course, our last my last, I think it's my last point for today, is the old argument of nature versus nurture. Now, many of you have probably heard of this. It certainly has been an age-old question as to, you know, what happens with that we have two people that are very similar. What happens, like monozygotic twins, identical twins? We can have them grow up and have the exact same genetic code that they got from their parents, but they have separate, different environments, okay, that they grew up in. What similarities are we going to see? What differences are we going to see? Are they going to talk the same? Are they going to have the same disposition? Are they going to be anxious? Are they going to be calm? Are they going to be predisposed to maybe depression or anxiety or some other, like schizophrenia? Keep in mind that it could be both. Okay, it could be both nature versus nature and nurture, both at the same time. Okay, and I believe in this course we also get into Minnesota Twin Study. How many of you have heard of the Minnesota Twin Study? Okay, so I see a hand or two up there. So that was really a milestone in how we understand the nature versus nurture. And just briefly, what it looked at was several hundred monozygotic twins that were separated at birth and grew up, and they were adopted out into different families in different parts of the country. And then the study looked at, they knew who they were and where they went, and then went to each one of them to see how they're different and how they're apart. And they found some pretty interesting similarities and some differences as well. Personality seemed to be very similar with a lot of them. And some mental health disorders or neurological disorders were prevalent. Like, for example, schizophrenia, I think is highly, like if one monozygotic twin has it, chances are it's like up to 80% chance that the other twin has that as well. So anyway, it really focused on mental health and those issues too, and personality as well as personality. Okay, I'm not going to go through Freud and Erikson's theories just because I'm going to be covering those a little bit later. And I do see that I am running up on time here. So does anybody have any questions for me before we depart today?
For me, yeah, so pretty much today we just need to focus on getting that correlation project done, the pack back, the introduction,